A big hello to everyone at the David Jones Research Center. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to present my paper at the conference. I am Rupsha Banerjee. I am Assistant Professor of English at St. Xavier's University, Kolkata, India. My research interests include contemporary British and American poetry, translation studies, and world literature studies. The paper that I'll be presenting today, Reading the Influence of David Jones in the Anti-Empiricist Poetics of Philip Gross, is something that I've been working on for quite a while, and I'm very grateful to be able to finally present it to an audience. I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you might have at the end of the presentation. I'll share the paper with Anna so that she can share it on the screen in case that makes it easier to follow the reading. So I'll just read my paper out loud right now. David Jones's poetry allows for a close engagement with British and Irish history as much as it studies the centrality of Celtic Christianity for engendering a sense of spirituality in the lands across the Irish seas. While the Anathemata and the Sleeping Lord demonstrate a historic understanding of the exchanges between the cultures of Britain and Ireland, the poetry also reveals the symbolic contact between the materiality of the environment and the religious significations of the verse. Paul Robichaud in David Jones and the Archipelagic Past writes, "For David Jones, matter is infused with spirit, but he is resolutely material in presenting the islands and seas of the British and Irish archipelago as the geological basis for the societies and cultures that developed there." This paper studies how David Jones's poetry underpins this very belief in the sacramental quality of the environment, in particular water as a sacrament that is both the history of the islanders and the holy substance that determines one's religious identity and makes possible the meeting of the Christian God with mankind. The writings of the Welsh-based poet Philip Gross, building on the tradition of Jones's poetry, allow for an examination of this very sacramental quality of water, but reads it with reference to the tidal landscape around the Bristol Channel, where the shaping of the land by water becomes a metaphor for the soul's conversation with the Christian God. For David Jones, art itself is a religious activity as it leads to the making of signs, and the environment, when represented within such a form of artistic anamnesis or a linguistic recall of the spiritual signification of the material world, becomes signs of something else. As he writes in the preface of the Anathemata to describe the spiritually enabled substitution of the word by the thing in itself, things that are the signs of something other, together with those signs that not only have the nature of a sign but are themselves, under some mode, what they signify. This dual existence of water as the enabler of one's religious identity, and on the other as a material sign of the history of cultural transactions between the British Isles, qualifies the Welsh landscape as sacred and makes Wales into what Robichaud calls the centre of an archipelago connected by the Irish Sea with a peripheral England to the south and east. The poetry of the Welsh-based poet Philip Gross builds on such a poetic practice of anti-empiricism, where language joins the sense of the religious with the perception of the wet and the damp in the Welsh landscape. Gross charts a poetic cartography that motivates the sense of the wet place, marking the boundary between the stable and the diffuse, as indicative of the complex and contentious relation between consciousness and language, and faith and religious practice. The sea in David Jones's The Anathemata provides the occasion for mapping geomorphic time and instantiates the commerce across the northern seas as occasions of cultural exchange and the mixing of languages. In the section Middle Sea and Lear Sea, where Jones concurrently transforms the sea into a document of history and offers it as a sacrament that makes manifest the meeting of the Christian God with mankind, he writes, "The makers of Anathemata can at a pinch beat out utile spares of the mobile columns or amulets for the raiding captains, and the captains themselves bring certain specifications and new god fears. The adaptations, the fusions, the transmogrifications, but always the inward continuities of the site of place. The metaphor of the Anathemata is significant for Jones because it allows the poem, taken as a whole, to perform the task of renewing one's relation to history and simultaneously to religious faith. The dual meaning of the Anathemata spells out the double purposiveness of Jones's verse in revealing the blessed things that have taken on what is cursed and the profane things that are somehow redeemed. The sea provides this very setting for revealing the universality of divine violence in myth as a logic of harm that characterizes empire. Further, the adaptations, the fusions, the transmogrifications that are at the heart of recognizing a thing as the other of itself are brought out in the act of distinguishing how the phonetic components of words characterizing seas often differ from their orthographic parts. For example, Mor Iverton, or the Irish Sea, pronounced as Mor Iverton, or Yreigion, or the deep, pronounced as Ur-Aegion, or Dyllanau, or seas, uttered as Dullanai. Tracing this invisible relation between seemingly arbitrary sounds and their orthographies directs one towards the later recognition of the sea in the Grail Mass and other works as subject to transformation caused by human blunder. Does the blind and shapeless creature of sea know the marking and indelible balm from float-seamed seaward and seeped valley waste? The shapelessness of the sea, uncontained by the shape of the words, makes itself pliable to both the creative and destructive aspects of the human imagination. David Jones's poetry then allows for a remaking of the sea as the deposit of myth and as the detritus of used and abused natural resource, all the while bringing the readers closer to the discernment of the word as a thing rather than as a stand-in for objects in the external world. In particular, tracing the different pronunciation patterns related to the English orthography when describing the Northern Seas discerns the open-ended nature of the significations associated with the sea, from being the setting for Western culture in its origins and British manifestations to enabling the sacramental merger of Christ with humanity. Philip Gross's poetry collections Mappa Mundi and The Water Table make the land around the Severn estuary into the very grounds for recording this continuing conversation between the human and what is perceived to be the divine. The next section is called Faith in Thin Places. In the Anathemata, in the opening section, right and foretime, myth forms the middle ground between the scientific accounts of glaciation in the Permo-Carboniferous age, there shall be yet more storm, dark sea, and the exaltation of the spiritual value of places within religious texts. This other laughless rock at the stone of division above the middle water deeps. Mythic fictionality makes the inconceivable timelines of geomorphic transformations into a part of narrative history and allows for the pagan and the Christian to exist within a continuous narrative. Faith, as presented within such a narrative, explores the horizons where the mutating empirical data of the physical sciences reaches towards the permanence of mythos, a paradigm of knowledge that is accessible to the poet by virtue of making use of the material form of utterance. The poetry of anti-empiricism as developed by David Jones is shaped by this very motive of making language express the mythic while pointing out the indissoluble unity between what the signifiers refer to in the natural world and the spiritual values attributed to those very objects within religious faith. The interconnections between nature and religious faith are embedded in medieval Welsh poetry and reveal the role of the Welsh landscape as a determinative factor in the subsequent fashioning of modern Welsh verse. In his essay The Myth of Arthur, Jones gives a description of the amphibious landscape that persists in the imagination of the Celts. The folk tradition of the insular Celts seems to present to the mind a half-aquatic world. It is one of its most fascinating characteristics. It introduces a feeling of transparency and interpenetration of one element with another, of transposition and metamorphosis. Jones's work is influenced by such an apprehension of the landscape where the intricate questions of faith can only be asked within an awareness of a molecular and constantly transforming quality of water. In the preface to the Anathemata, Jones further qualifies water as the inscrutable substance that exists as a sign whose empirical properties cannot wholly explain its function in religious ritual and its referential significations in poetic language. Water, he writes, is called the matter of the sacrament of baptism. Is two of hydrogen and one of oxygen that matter? But what concerns us here is whether the poet can and does so juxtapose and condition within a context the formula H2O as to evoke founts, that innocent creature, the womb of this divine font, etc. Jones's demarcations of the different attributes of water point towards the insufficiency of poetic description when it is only aimed towards providing an account of what is seen rather than articulating the very practice of seeing. It is significant to note here that John Milton, in Selections from a Christian Doctrine, marks out this plurality of significations in relation to the characterization of the Godhead in the Bible, where God is both spirit, God is a spirit, as John writes in 4:4, but also an essence that includes potentiality. Romans 11:35, from him and through him are all things. Or what Milton describes as the possibility of God's containing the matter and thus the material potency that he shaped in creating the world. The representation or anamnesis of water in David Jones's poetry points towards this very property of hypostasis, where language designates not the thing itself, but the essence of the thing in the abstract. This mercurial property of water that imbues the Welsh landscape with a spiritual value is studied in Philip Gross's Mappa Mundi by marking the river and the land around it as a space for spiritual contemplation, as seen in the poem Walking the Knife. Further, in a poem such as Thin Places from Mappa Mundi, Gross provides descriptions of non-sounds, a mute bell on a church tower. The bell bows its head to the clapper, ready to accept the blow that does not fall. And a silence in libraries, hush. In this long-held breath, the least sound would be critical. To capture the sensation of being in an interstitial or a thin place, which within Celtic spiritual writings is understood as a place between matter and non-matter, water and land. The onomatopoeic command of hush corresponds to the sensation of silence and evokes a natural or direct relation with imagined sound. The embodiment of meaning by the sign is further reproduced through the use of compound words such as long-held, puddle-glassed, unbook, and moth blurs, where the hyphen progressively makes the reader encounter the shapes of the words rather than their meanings. The unusual sound units of the compound words, the repetition of words in phrases such as grows and free for all, free fall, the presence of caesuras and the run-on lines form an integral part of the hermeneutics of sound in the poem and results in the poem orally producing the shape of thin places. Philip Sheldrake, in Living Between Worlds, Place and Journey in Celtic Spirituality, conjectures that thin place was perhaps first used by Dr. George MacLeod to describe the Isle of Iona, the site of St. Columba's monastery, as a place where the membrane between this world and the other world, between the material and the spiritual, was very permeable. In Gross's poem, thin places are marked out in the library as empty spaces between books where the absence of words makes way for life to enter into the material world, a determinative non-shape, or as Gross calls it, an unbook that marks the dual existence of the word as logos and as spirit. Marking a move away from the characterization of the sound of the poem, either as recalling the fact of the religious faith or as enacting national identity, Gross's representations of multiple water bodies in the water table, from the Bristol Channel to the Severn, are largely anonymous and orally distinctive. In Severn Song, the alternating A-B rhyme scheme of the four-line stanzas and the accompanied internal rhymes produced from the repetition of words demonstrates a self-propelling poetic artifice that contains the question of the intertwinement of spirit and matter within the description of the natural landscape that exists in the field of historic time. For a moment, not doing nor coming undone, words gained, words lost, till who's to say which was the father, which was the son, a week or 50 years away. The inherent contradiction in ascertaining the chronological priority between the Creator and the Son, indicated in John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, provides the basis for the characterization of the landscape that is at once matter and organism, a continuing conversation between the immanent and particularized selfhood. The even number of sequences entitled Between Land represent the rhythmical cyclicality of water, the rise and fall of the tide. The temporary overcoming of the linearity of messianic time, manifested in the ritual observance of sacrament, is characterized by the movement of the estuary through identical phrasal constructions that introduce contradictions in their claims. For example, but the water said earth and the water said sky. Further, the concluding stanza of Severn Song presents a tautology that grammatically performs the contradiction in ascertaining the creative impulse outside of which the creator exists and which he uses to create the world. Every angle of light that says you, that says I, and the sea was the river, the sea. Tony Conran, in his note on gifts in spirit level, writes that Welsh poetry stems from a tradition of second person poetry that travels all the way back to Taliesin. A poem praises, satirizes, or laments within the magnetic field of I and thou. For Philip Ross, the Severn Estuary exists as this dialogue between the self and the spirit, where recording the geographical changes affected by the body of water conflates the interiority of religious experience with the external sensorial apprehension of the landscape. Thank you so very much. I shall look forward to any questions that you might have, and I very much look forward to reading your papers as well. Thank you.